Hello, welcome to another episode of Learning with Leah. We're gonna get started building a basic rock so I can show you start to finish exactly how I model things and how to use automatic UVing the right way, just in case you ever feel that urge to do something really easy. So I'm gonna start with a basic polygon, which is, a square, and then subdivide it by going to Channel Box Editor, clicking on Polycube 1, subdivisions, upping on the height, 2, no, that's not what I wanted to do, subdivisions, there we go, and width, and depth. And then to make a cool funky shape, you're just going to go into the vertexes, pull them apart, fun little places, push them in. Might go on the bottom, go to edges, click on the bottom. And choke it. So it's actual rock shapey. Go back to vertices. Sorry if you hear my computer breathing, it's not in a good mood today. Alright, so we've got basic rock shape. Vertices are a little weird. That's intended. And then we can go into object mode, select the object, and let's say that we wanted to do an automatic UV. So you go into UV editor, and it looks like a basic box, which is not what this is. So we go to UV, let's see, automatic. And it unfolds in a pretty decent place, but then if we click on the checkerboard thing, it's probably going to make a liar out of me. Nope, it didn't. So there's some weird distortion going on here. So we're going to click on this face and see what happened here. Let's see, UV shell. That's part of that UV shell. So this is one of the reasons that I don't recommend using automatic, but like if you're going to, because you need to, that's totally fine. We can go in here, go to UV cut and sew. Ah, son of a biscuit. Edge, then UV cut and sew. And go ahead and slice and dice where we want it to cut off right there. And then go into Q, modify, after we select the actual UV shell, modify, unfold. Now we have this as a separate object. So you can see the distortion already kind of fixed itself because we separated one from the other. And now we can go in there, drag this off, and actually get it to exactly where we want it by resizing. And we're just trying to make sure that these squares look like the squares that are above it. So we go in, make it a little bit bigger, so that's about the right size, and then we can zoom out. I don't need the checkerboard anymore because the rest of this stuff looks pretty decent. All the squares are square and they're not odd little rectangles. So we can go in here, select all the UVs. One thing that I've found is you can actually have it lay it out for you by just doing Control L or clicking layout, and it squishes it all together the way that it's programmed to. But another problem that you might have is it really gets close on overlapping UVs. So if you're texturing in like Photoshop or whatever, that's really not a good thing. So you can go in here in the UV shells and just make them a little bit smaller, just to make sure that we don't have any problems laying on down the line when we're actually texturing. That one looks pretty good. I'm gonna move it over just a little bit. And because we're painting in substance, it doesn't really matter the orientation of this. Like this right here is technically lopsided, so if you wanted to correct it so it was like in the correct orientation, up and down, left and right reading as we do in America, then we could correct it, but it's not necessary. It's just a thing that you can do to make your UVs look prettier and easier to read if you're painting in anything other than Substance Painter. But we don't need to do that, so I'm going to leave it the way it was. And turn this off so you can see my layout, the layout that I did here. And this is not beveling just because I don't want to deal with those extra faces. This is just like super basic bitch rock that we're going to go ahead and save a snapshot of just in case. So we're going to do rock example version 2, save. And you always want to make sure you have it 2048 by 2048. Make sure that you actually pick where it's supposed to be going. Like if you're making a project in environmental art folder, make sure that you put the UV snapshot in the environmental art folder so you know where it is and it's not just somewhere on your desktop that you can't find. I may or may not have personal experience in that area. Yeah, so then you just apply and close what after you select all the UV shells. I always do that. So now we have a UV snapshot, but that's just in case you want to paint in Photoshop, not necessarily what we're going to be doing. So now what we do is we go into here, export all, and make sure it's set on FBX export. You don't need to pay attention to any of these other options for now. And let's see, desktop, Monster Wilds. I'm going to save it in here, and under scenes is where I have all of my FBX things, so if I'm ever looking for something, it's going to be in this folder. And you might want to do that too to streamline your workflow. Just make sure that you have everything that you're looking for of a specific file type in one folder. Like I have textures in a textures folder. My FBX exports are all in a scene folder. Let's do rock example 2v1 FBX export all. Cool, so that's done. Oh yeah, I didn't save, just kidding. Set project. Set. Alright, now we're done with that. It'll close eventually. Sometimes it gets moody. Alright, then we go ahead and open up Substance Painter. Our 3D painting software. The reason that I really like Substance Painter is because unlike in Photoshop, you can see in real time what it's going to look like on the 3D model and actually paint on the surfaces. So I always go ahead and start a new one. We're going to have a template in here that's Unreal Engine 4 because we're actually using our game meshes in Unreal, and instead of having like Unity, we definitely want to have Unreal. So set that to Unreal, and then this is where you select the FBX. It's right under template. There's file, and we go in. It's already here because I did a lot of paintings earlier, so we do rock example 2v1. Go ahead and open it up. All of these things should be fine. Document resolution is the same as the UV snapshot that we already exported and aren't going to use, but it's fine. These are baked maps for all materials. We didn't bake any maps, so we don't need to worry about that, but if you did a really high resolution thing and then took the high resolution and baked it onto a low resolution, this is where you would add the normal map so that your textures don't get confused when you try and put it in the engine. So got the FBX, got all the settings right, doing it for Unreal, click OK. And wow, look! It's the same snapshot that I just had that was attached to the FBX export. So good! So this is the actual model. And the way that I go about painting is I usually go over here and there's a little paint bucket tool that has a plus sign next to it. I go ahead and I click it, and that just adds a new fill layer. So it comes in as like default white. It's like a blank slate, but I want it to be dark gray because we're going to be painting rocks. So I'm going to make it a little bit warm gray. I'm going to start it off right there. And then on the next layer, which I will explain, if you ever want to do something completely separate, so like I had the mushrooms, I would have two different shaders on the same thing. So there's Lambert 1, which is for one object, and Lambert 2, which is like for another one. If you added another material in Maya, it would actually show up here as two separate textures that you could edit independent of each other instead of just using multiple layers, which is really useful because if you're painting on one shader that's only applied to one part of the model, it'll only affect that model. There won't be any bleed between the two of them. So as you can see, if I close the Lambert shader, that's literally my entire model. That's the mesh that I'm looking at right now because it's the material that I imported from Maya. So we've got the fill layer, dark green, dark gray. And I'm actually going to go ahead and hook up my tablet. If I can find this document. Because this is the fun part. This is the painting part. Alright. As soon as it connects. There we go. Alright, so we're going to go to layer 1. Never, ever, ever do multiple things on the same layer. If you're going to do another thing like shading or highlights, make sure you go over here. It's the little box looking thing with a plus sign, and click it and make a new layer. There won't be anything in it because it's a new fresh blank slate, but it'll separate things. So if you go in here and you're like, I want something that's like red on this surface, and you're like, that looks like shit, I don't want that anymore, then you can just close it off just in case you want to go back to it, or you can go over here and click the trash button and it'll take it away. So you don't need to ever think about the fact that you painted red on a gray rock. Some of the basic things that I'll go over here are when you're painting, the brush default is not at a full hardness. Like there's going to be a soft edge to whatever you're painting. So I don't know if I can make the brush big enough to where you can actually see it. But if you zoom in, like there's a soft edge on the edge of the color that we're putting on the rock right now. And we don't usually want that unless we're blending. So size is controlled right here, or you can control it with the brackets next to the P on your keyboard. Same thing if you're doing something in Word or whatever. If you do like control and use the brackets, it changes the size. Same shortcut. Flow is going to be important when we're blending. So flow is basically like how much color is going to come out. So you can see now, like I can make it as bright as this, but it already comes out like pretty low. It's like controlling exactly how much is going to be put on the model every stroke that you make. I usually leave flow at 100 to start out with before I'm blending. Stroke opacity is another thing that's really useful. If you use it in tandem with flow, it can get a lot of really good blend effects and stuff like that. So if I knock stroke opacity down and I knock flow down and I make the brush pretty big, I can start blending from gray to red. Like you can see over here, I got the light gray, and then like the medium red tone, and then the actual red tone, and that's what we will be doing as soon as we get to highlights and shadows. So that's just like painting 101. It's the only way you can really control how you blend is opacity and flow. So we're going to knock that back up because we're going to start with highlights. Most of these things you don't really need to pay attention to. We're not going to be using jitter a whole lot because we're not going to be painting individual like specks onto this thing, and I don't have any pre-saved brushes because there's nothing I do that makes that useful. Another thing with blending is when you're going to be blending, you always want the hardness of the brush to be at absolute 0. So that's the parameters under alpha. You want the hardness to be, instead of at 100, which does a line like this, you want it to be at 0, which is a line like that. So there's the edges are not sharp, they're fuzzy. And that just adds another layer of blending ability, but I like it hard to start out with. And then Another thing we can do in Substance, which is really cool, is you can do material mode, and you can come in here, and if something's usually like aluminum or some type of skin or metal or rust or wood tone, you can actually paint a color with the um, with the texture of a wood. So if we do like wood that's rough, we can set a color to like yellow, and it'll be like this weird wooden yellow texture that we paint on here. So if I zoom in, you can see like this was the basic color over here, and this was the with the texture that we're putting on the side with the custom color. It has added bonus of texture. I usually don't use that because it's not usually necessary, but you can add some cool texture if you're doing like a tree. You can add a couple of these if you make the brush really big. You can add some like bark looking things and stuff like that. Like I said, I don't usually use that, but it's a thing that you can apply to the texture if you think that it'll make it look better. So this is the most important thing, is your base color. You can use a reference, say like I had a folder open, and let's see what we got. Let's say I was painting the player character, which I'm not, but we can see. I can go into base color and do this guy right here and drag him, and I can pick up any color on the entire screen, like the white, the pink, anywhere. You can have a reference open with all the color references that we have for the game open on a totally different window as a reference and still pick up the right color. So like I said, I got pink from there, and then it'll come in as your base color right here. Other things that we need to pay attention to is height, which is not totally important, roughness, which is actually quite important. So if you go to the fill layer, it has the roughness is at a pretty low level, and you can see it's pretty reflective. But if we knock that up, it takes the reflectivity down a whole lot because it's a rock. It doesn't have a whole lot of reflectivity, so we're gonna kind of zone it in exactly where we want it to be. And it's not metallic, so we can leave that alone. Normal is not important right now because we're not actually painting height onto this UV thing. So what else we got? We'll go back to layer. I think that's it for layer. Okay, so I'm gonna get rid of this and do a new layer. So I usually start with highlights just because I'm back asswards like that. And so if we've got like a dark gray, probably want to go in with like a medium tone gray to start out with, because you know you don't actually highlight with white. And paint the edges. So I'm just using my stylus and I'm literally painting on the 3D model, being kind of careful not to overlap onto any side too easily or too much. And you can see over here that the face that I'm painting on has the color on it. Like, I'm painting on the 3D surface and it's appearing on the UV. Woo! It's so nuts. So if you actually get the face that you want, and you want to be a lot more precise with it without a whole lot of bleed, you can go back onto the UV and paint just that part of it. Let me blunt the edges a little bit. I'm actually going to double check and make sure that I know what a rock looks like. So, let's do... Okay, so we're getting there. So then I'm going to go in with actual, like, highlights on the side of the rock. Maybe that's like a little edge to the rock that we want to throw in there. There's some other spots down here that we could paint onto it. Oh, and you can see that I didn't edit the brush roughness. So it's super shiny. So we can go ahead and like knock this up and it'll stop being shiny. Like you can see the huge difference between super metallic, super not rough, and super rough and not shiny at all. So whenever you're making a base layer and you're like, oh, this shouldn't be rough at all, and then you go into a fill layer, it's not going to have the same settings, so make sure you crank up the roughness and whatever. We're just going to ignore that I didn't do that and move on. So then after you've got like the highlights blocked in, we're just going to pretend that like this is pretty done. Most of the face of the rock right there. And then another face on the rock right there. We're going to go back in. Let's just reference again. Yep, with dark. So like I said, new layer. Always do a new layer. And we're going to go in and knock the hardness down. We're going to knock the stroke opacity down, flow down. So we have a pretty blurry brush to start blending a darker color out on top with. And then we go down to our base color. And our base color of the rock is pretty dark, so we're probably going to have to go almost to black, but not quite. And then we can go ahead and make the brush pretty big. And start, nope, that's still light. There we go. And start, I'm going to knock this up a little bit more because it's actually doing less than I thought it was. There we go, now I can see it. And start blending it together and do a bunch of little things. And like, I'm just doing this so you can see exactly how I work the brushes. I'm probably not going to keep this texture because it's not the way like I would normally do things. I'm just like demonstrating all the different capabilities of Substance Painter. And a lot of people, what they do is instead of like actually setting up, you know, a fill layer and a highlight layer and a dark layer, they'll just go down to this area down here and pick up this thing and drag and drop it so it looks, you know, like a rock and stuff, which is nice. You can do that, but never ever leave it at just that because it looks like absolute shit. What you do is you take the highlight layer and you put it on top of that. So then, you know, you have the highlights and everything else. So then it's not just, you know, like the default setting because we don't want that. I don't want that. And it's not really necessary for that level of detail to be in our game either. Like, we don't need a rock that looks like concrete. It's just nice to have. Yeah, just like... Oh, and another really cool thing is the eraser works. If you're ever doing something and, you know, like a normal pencil you could draw and then erase on the next layer, you can do that in Substance, which is super nice. Let's see. Knock this up. And a lot of it's just going to be experimenting with what you guys like and like how you like painting and stuff like that. It's not all going to be like, oh, I'm going to do this exactly the way Leah did and stuff like that. So it's probably going to require a lot of experimenting on your part to get down exactly what you like. So this is pretty dark. If I wanted to have like a more illustrative quality, then I would go ahead and like draw in things with a dark color and do little rock faces on top of a flat surface to make sure that we're all, you know, doing that kind of thing. But yeah, that's like start to finish exactly how you would want to set this up to paint. And the biggest thing that I can impress upon you is blending is super important. So I have, you know, the really dark color here, and then if I go in and I knock the stroke opacity down pretty far, and I knock the flow down pretty far, you can see how like each little thing gets separated, like they're different, right? Yeah. and then the hardness all the way down so it's nice and blurry. You can start blending the line between the concrete and the rock in the painting that you just did. Blending is super important. It makes a lot of things look really professional, even if you definitely screwed up a lot of things in your painting. Yeah, that's all I have for today on this episode of Learning with Leah. I hope you had a lot of fun. If you have any questions on how I get from here to there, let me know. And the last thing I have to show you is how you export. So once you're done doing all this fun stuff, painting and blending and scribbling and stuff like that, you go into File and Export Textures, and make sure you set the export directory to the actual folder that you're working in. So I have Fauna working on right now, and I created my own custom folder for textures. I'm going to select folder. We want it to be output template for Unreal. We want the file type to be PNG. The rest of the stuff is totally fine. And these are on the left side is where you select like certain shaders. If you didn't edit a shader, you don't need to export it. But we definitely edited the Lambert shader, so we want to export it. And then we just click export. It compiles the occlusion, normal, emissive, and base color for us. Woohoo! And then what that looks like is when we open up the file in textures, we have rock. There we go. So these ones right here are all the ones that we just made when we were painting. So it has a normal map for the shiny parts that I forgot to dull down. It has an occlusion map for all the things that are like really dark that I forgot to dull down, and the basic colors and everything in the base color. Yeah. And so like you once you get the hang of it, you'll be able to do things like this mushroom render. You can actually like paint little lines on the stock so it looks really cool, and add dots on the hood so they actually look like mushrooms. And this is one of the export textures that I had. It like I painted every single line that you see on here. I did highlights, and then I went back in and I blended out some of the shadows, and I blended in some more highlights on top of the bark areas. And I know I mentioned before in one of the other things that I had, if you have an area of your model that is not going to need a lot of detail, you can make it really small and move it onto the edge of your UV map, which is what I did with the inside of the log, which is over here. And I just kind of did like a little swirly because it's not important, and no one is going to see the inside of my log. So it's not super important, but you can tell that I spent a lot of time doing the texture on the log that everyone is actually going to see. So, yeah. And, yeah, so like normally in Photoshop, if you were going to open a snapshot, you wouldn't get like the bleed that the Substance Painter gives you. Like for every area out here, you'd have to color in on Photoshop and not really be able to see the snapshot that you're coloring on. But if there's like an edge that you colored over, a Substance will automatically go ahead and put a bleed on the edge so it goes to the next UV area, so there's no loss of detail that you add in Substance, and it's really, really nice. So that's all I can think of to say. I guess I could double go over the organic way of UVing, because that's super important. Just to make sure that everyone knows how to do. If everyone's here for Substance, you can stop watching this video now. I'm just going to go over UVing organic shapes again, since I know a couple of you mentioned that you were interested in taking on monsters. My voice hurts. I don't know how teachers do this, man. My voice hurts, and I haven't even talked for like a full hour. Okay, so let's say I have a sphere. And it's a pretty complicated sphere, and I want it to look really nice. Woo, fun. In our UV. Or I want it to unfold a certain way. Let's actually just make it an ear so I can actually demonstrate the process. So object mode, I'm actually going to delete this, go in here and model an ear really quick, get this down. So let's say we have a pretty high poly ear on top of a face that we're going to have that's different. So let's just go ahead and get the face down here and extrude it. So like ear on top of a pretty complicated face. So that's not going to UV all that well, especially if we want things to actually like carry over decent detail and texture. So the way that we're going to do that is go into UV, and do not automatic UV that shit. Do not do it. I know it's very tempting, like I said in the beginning of the video, like you can, and it's doable, but only do that for things that don't matter. Never do that for a monster, because it's not going to end well for you. Just trust me. Alright, so when we're doing this, make sure we have the object selected, and we go to edge mode, and then UV cut and sew tool. Woo! That's fun. And we're going to go ahead and get rid of the lines that they automatically gave us by using the control button on your computer, or command if you're on a Mac. Please don't be on a Mac. And then going over everything, just to eliminate the white lines that Maya went ahead and gave us, because we don't need that shit. We are independent women and we don't need no automatic UV. Alright, so we have ear on top of face. So easiest way to do that is to remember exactly how everything unfolds. We want to make sure that things are going to unwrap in a logical way. So we definitely want to separate the ear from the base. So we go ahead and I just double clicked this line. If there's a normal curve that Maya recognizes as like a complete curve, if you double click on it, just like when you're selecting it, it'll go ahead and make a slice along that curve. If you're doing a really complicated model, I'd be really careful. What I normally do if I'm drawing on an organic shape is just zoom into where I want, and then you can click and drag down the line that you want the cut to appear, and it'll cut down that line. So you can see nothing else happened, it just dragged and cut right exactly where I wanted it to go. And like I said, if you ever accidentally like hit there and when you're going down the line, you can always go back with control and click. Sometimes you have to double click, but it'll always save your ass if you accidentally do something that you didn't want to. And sometimes the clicking is a little bit finicky. That's okay. Just, go in there and drag. You'll always be able to tell if it cut or not, because it'll give you like a thick line instead of a normal one, like right there and right there. And everywhere that there's white instead of blue is a cut that you're making. So we've got the ear set to unwrap in a pretty nice way. I'm probably gonna leave this part attached just so I don't have to deal with two halves of the whole. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut there. And we can see what that looks like now. So whenever I'm ready to see what a model looks like after I've cut pieces of it, I go into the UV editor and I go to modify and then scroll down to the end, which is Control U or unfold, and it gives me a look at what I did. So right here is the ear that I just UV'd and cut off of the base part. So this is not a good UV because I haven't done the base part yet, but this is just illustrating exactly what I did and why I did it. So I wanted the ear to stay one piece because it's easier to paint that way. And the easiest way to do that would be to cut it off of the base, which is really big, and it won't unfold the right way if we left it together. And then you almost cut it in half, but not all the way. So this bottom piece right here is still where the ear is attaching itself from one side to another. But the slice that I made right down the middle is where it's separating, so it can actually unfold in a as flat as possible. So the detail looks good. Like you can see all of the squares are mostly not deformed. They're pretty nice on the ear. And I could have gone in here and sliced every side open, but it's not really necessary as long as you can get it pretty close. But you can see the bottom is an absolute fucking mess, which is fine. So we go in there and we undo what we just did and stop unfolding. And go back to edge mode. Once we're on the object, UV, 3D cut and sew UV tool, and then go ahead, I'm going to click the bottom part and get that sliced out. And I'm probably going to also slice here. That looks pretty good. Bottom is separated from the top, and the top can unfold in 2 places. Alright, so now that we have that done, go back to our selection, which is just Q on the keyboard, object mode, and then go to the UV editor, UV shell, select all the UV shells, and then go to modify, unfold, and then UV shell, click on one, move it out of the way so we can see what we did. That's one part of the top, that's the other part of the top, and this is the bottom. So if you click on the checkerboard, you can see that the bottom is a lot bigger in terms of like the squares than the top is. So we definitely want to change that. The bottom is not all that important, but for the purpose of this tutorial, I'm going to make sure that everything looks vaguely the same. So on what program am I in? Maya. On Maya, the bigger the UV gets on the UV editor, the smaller the texture detail is, or the more texture that the UV can hold. So that looks about right for the amount of detail that we have on the top. They are a little bit distorted. You can see they're more rectangly than they are square. So we're going to go over here and fix that by resizing the bottom so they look square. And then we're going to go in on the top. And I might have cut where I didn't need to. So we're going to go in here and take a look and see if I can do any remedial UVing here, which I can. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold shift over the edge that I just selected. And because there's no issues in unfolding here, like if I attach this edge to this edge, there won't be any conflict. Like it'll just turn, and I can actually just, you know, make sure that everything's going to go exactly the way I want it to, and turn it around. So the reason I separated it to begin with is I was worried that like the diagonals wouldn't go exactly the way I wanted it to if I left them together. But I can go ahead and hold shift, right click, and move and sew edges, so that's part of one, and then click this one, shift, right click, move and sew edges, so they're part of like one UV instead of multiple UVs. And then I'm probably gonna like correct this, make it smaller. And then when we're laying out things, it's super important. You can see the quadrant up here. It goes from 0 to 1. This is the only quadrant that we want our UVs to be in when we export a snapshot. So whenever you're laying it out, you want to make sure that you have as big of a area covered by your UVs as possible while still fitting inside the first grid. So for this one, I'm going to go ahead and rotate it so we can maximize. It's like playing a really advanced game of Tetris. And then for this one, we're going to have to knock it down quite a bit, looks like. Let's get that in here, make sure it's inside the lines, then we can make it a little bit bigger again. Still good, still inside the lines. and make sure none of your textures are ever overlapping. You don't want overlapping texture, it'll screw up the painting process. And now that we have that, like we have the bottom piece properly cut out, we have the bottom of the bottom piece properly cut out, and we have the ear unwrapped. So if I wanted to paint part of the ear, then I would be painting this side, and then this side would be the back of the ear. And yeah, that's pretty much how you do organic shapes. The organic shapes are going to be a lot more complicated than this. If you're doing something that has like a body, then you would separate the head, then separate the ears on the head. Anything that sticks out away from the sphere or the cylinder of the head, you separate so you can unfold it properly. And you always cut off the neck from the torso from the legs, the feet from the legs. Sometimes you do the knees depending on how long they are and how like much detail you want to put in the actual painting that you're doing of the texture. And you always make sure you get the shoulder off of the torso, and sometimes the elbow, not always, depending on how you modeled it. If there's a curve there and you don't want to have any distortion, then you cut it off at the elbow, and you always cut the hand off and unfold it the easiest way you can. And it's pretty straightforward. You just got to think logically, like, how is this shape going to unfold, and can I get it to do what I want it to do, drawing these white lines along the edges of your model. Yeah, so that's just like a quick little recap. And if I wanted to export it, I would go in here, UV snapshot, and then, you know, save it, and then do the file export, export all, or export selection, depending on if you have multiple models in the scene or not. And then you'd go in and you paint like I did in the beginning of this video. So yeah, that's all I have. That's actually all I have. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.